All right, welcome back, everybody. Today I have another really special guest on, and this will be a bit of a different kind of conversation here. We're going to dive into the crazy world of NFTs and copyright and a ton of really interesting things that are going on at this intersection. And so I want to welcome 4156 to the program. I was going to introduce you as Punk 4156, but I know some things have changed over the last couple of weeks that we can certainly dive into. But why don't we start off with just a quick intro to yourself and kind of your journey into crypto?
Yeah, sure, and thank you for the introduction. I'm an anon for now, operating as 4156. I've been in the crypto space since about 2013, when I was working in tech, kind of in a creative field within tech, and discovered Bitcoin. Like many others, kind of read the Satoshi white paper and went down the rabbit hole. Remember having a couple of very distinct moments where when I finally grokked the Bitcoin white paper, just kind of like, standing up and realizing it was going to change the world. Continued to operate in the space as a function of both, I guess, kind of buying crypto early on and just being very, very interested in what it was going to do, and went full-time crypto pretty early on. Kind of discovered Ethereum early on as well, and I think that was another kind of aha moment for me in the space when I understood this, the idea of tokenization and what the proliferation of tokens would mean. And then I would say probably my third aha moment was just over a year ago. I had originally claimed some CryptoPunks without really thinking too much about them, but then started thinking more deeply about non-fungible tokens. That most of the objects in the world can be represented as non-fungible rather than fungible, and what these tokens would mean for culture, and that ultimately it would be culture that would take crypto mainstream rather than the financial applications that we'd all been used to. So I kind of developed a pretty deep thesis, I would say, on non-fungible tokens, and then just started operating primarily in the NFT subsector of the Ethereum economy.
Yeah, that's a great place for us to jump in. You mentioned kind of claiming your first CryptoPunk or CryptoPunks. Maybe talk us through a little bit of what that experience was like. I think you mentioned that was earlier this year, maybe around February. So what that experience was like claiming these punks, and what really attracted you to CryptoPunks initially?
Yeah, sure. So the punks were actually claimed in 2017, I believe. At the time, that was just it seemed like an experiment that someone had released. Turned out Larva Labs had released onto Ethereum. They were released for free. At the time, there was no MetaMask. There weren't sophisticated wallets. You had to be pretty deep down the rabbit hole already to have the infrastructure ready to kind of claim these. Was kind of looking at them with some friends, and we messed around and kind of claimed, I don't know, it was like a handful each, 5 or 6, and then really just forgot about them for quite a long time. And again, it was just about a year ago when I started to really think a lot more about these non-fungible tokens that I thought, well, I still have some of these punks. Let me take a look at them. And of course, the prices had started to increase, and as tends to happen, I think, prices sometimes kind of initiate a bit of a mental feedback loop as well, where you start thinking about why is this happening? What does it mean? And then as I developed more of a thesis and had more conviction around what they could potentially mean, I started to buy a lot of them, including Punk. Then as I developed more of a thesis and had more conviction around what they could potentially mean, I started to buy a lot of them, including Punk 4156, which I purchased. I believe it was a 625 or 650 ETH that I paid. Which I'm not sure if it was the first, but it was certainly one of the first $1 million CryptoPunk sales at the time. So I guess I had obviously kind of acquired a lot of conviction fairly quickly that these were going to be important digital objects.
And what was as you were starting to put this thesis together, and you mentioned you started to get more conviction around them being, let's say, an integral, at least an early iteration of what these digital objects could be and the value associated with those. What was that thesis, right? And why do you think that something like CryptoPunks has really taken off? And certainly, yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily call it, let's say, mainstream adoption, but within, let's say, the crypto world, certainly pretty much everyone at this point has heard of CryptoPunks. So what is it about them themselves that you think, and we can obviously dovetail this into some other projects that you're working on, what is it about them that really, attracted you and why you thought these could accrue value over the long term?
I think initially it was just an intuition. I think the idea that people were using them as their Twitter PFPs, that people were starting to kind of think about digital identity more deeply, and to think about kind of ownership around that identity. That the punk is a kind of a digital original, and a kind of claim on OG-ness in the context of the Ethereum economy. So I think that was the kind of initial thinking. I had also thought it was very, very interesting it would be interesting to try to build a brand around a CryptoPunk. So part of my motivation, specifically around buying 4156, was I thought the ape looked cool. It looked like it had a bit of attitude with the blue bandana, and that it would be fun to create a kind of digital artist persona for the punk. I've been personally speculating in financial markets and doing things in financial markets for a long time now. And I find that typically there's no one, when one gets very, very bullish on an idea or an asset class, there's typically more than one reason to want to buy something. And I think I saw in punks, again, this kind of confluence of many different factors around digital identity and ownership, around digital originals, around punks being the first of their kind, like the originator of the form, and that could give them value. And then also potentially as an object that one could build a brand around, that would be something completely new and potentially very interesting for that reason.
Yeah, this concept of being able to build brands and kind of, we'll say, monetize the likeness or uniqueness of these different, we'll call them NFT collectibles or collections, right, has certainly gained a lot of prominence, especially in the last few months. And one project I know you're involved with, and we will bring this kind of back full circle to punks, because there is some interesting activity that's been happening there, especially with you specifically over the last few weeks, that I definitely want to get into. But taking a quick kind of sidestep here, one of the projects you're heavily involved in is Nouns, right? And I think that they're one of the most interesting, I won't say derivatives of the kind of punk world, but they're a very interesting kind of NFT collectible. And I would love to hear, one, from your own words, what is Nouns? What was kind of the origin story around Nouns themselves, and what makes them unique versus something like a CryptoPunk?
Yeah, sure. So Nouns started kind of in deep in my imagination. I had been thinking about punks and experimenting with punks and owning punks, and I had really started to think about how, if punks are the kind of originator of the form, I've called them elsewhere the kind of Citizen Kane of the form of PFP projects, collectibles, communities, however we want to define it. If they're the Citizen Kane, they really define the form. They did that in 2017, and over the previous 6 months, as punks had become popularized, we hadn't really seen a whole lot of innovation happen around the model. We'd seen a lot of kind of copycats, a lot of people taking what punks had done and kind of imitating it, but nobody had built punks 2.0 or really started to think about what that might be. And so I had spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what are the other primitives here that would be interesting, that could really extend this idea, and make it more than a kind of digital collectible, that could really make it a community that had capital, that had ownership, and that had an ability to kind of proliferate something larger, potentially make something that could become the world's largest open source brand. And so I wrote down a bunch of those ideas in a Twitter thread, and very fortunately, as a function of having a big presence on Twitter and having built in the technology world for a long time, I was able to meet a bunch of people that wanted to help build the idea together. And so a group of 10 of us got together, really based on a Twitter thread, and over a period of 3 months, kind of fleshed out some of the ideas that I put forth in the thread into the Nouns project.
And so a lot of projects, start off as, or come to market, I should say, as, let's say, 10,000 different unique versions of some type of, central IP or some type of central avatar in a sense. And those will get auctioned off or they'll get claimed. And there's 10,000 that exist right off the bat, right? What I find really interesting about Nouns, and maybe you can walk us through this, what is the kind of distribution mechanism for every single noun, and how is that, again, a bit different from something like a punk or a Bored Ape or the other kind of distribution models you've seen so far?
Right. Yeah, that's right. So Nouns, what the tagline of Nouns is one noun every day forever. And so how Nouns work is that the initial supply, when we created the project on Ethereum, the initial supply was 0. And one noun is created every 24 hours and auctioned off 24 hours. And this happens kind of automatically on Ethereum. So it's not like the founders are kind of minting one of these nouns every 24 hours. The project is governed by a set of smart contracts that automatically, as long as Ethereum exists, and as long as people want to bid on nouns, these smart contracts auction off one noun every 24 hours forever. And the kind of settlement of the previous auction kicks off the next auction. And so there's, in essence, always a noun being auctioned. And that's the way the supply grows. So it would actually take 27 years approximately to reach, the magic number of 10,000 nouns, which is kind of the standard for these PFP projects now. As of today, I believe we're on noun 147. So we're just a few months into the history of the project, and so 147 of these nouns have been created. Part of the thinking behind that mechanism is really that kind of fairness and credibility is a fundamental property of these crypto platforms, and that auctioning off one unit every day forever kind of creates a more equal opportunity across crypto epochs for people to discover the project and buy in. So in the case of CryptoPunks, for example, that when the 10,000 of them were created in 2017, well, if you happen to be online, at the time they were released, or 24 hours after, I believe they sold out around a day after they were released, then that was very fortunate for you, and you were very lucky to be in the right time and place. Cryptodes, same thing, another kind of similar PFP project. If you happen to be online, for the 1 hour period before they sold out, then that's of course very, very fortunate for you. But there's not a kind of fundamental fairness there that creates equal opportunities across time to become a member of the community. So one of the fundamental components of nouns is this kind of equal access to nouns, because one noun is auctioned every day forever.
And one thing I also think that's really interesting is the funding to purchase every noun rolls into a Nouns DAO kind of treasury, right? So if you mentioned 147, let's say tomorrow's 148. If I go out and I buy noun 148 for 50 ETH, let's say, that ETH actually gets rolled into a DAO or a treasury that the Nouns community can use to reinvest or really deploy however they see fit, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So unlike a lot of other NFT projects or almost all other NFT projects where the proceeds from the auctions go to the creators, and then it's kind of at the creators' discretion how much they want to keep for themselves versus how much they want to kind of reinvest in the community. In the case of Nouns, 100% of the noun auction proceeds go into the Nouns DAO, which is the organization that is governed collectively by all of the nouns. So one noun NFT is not just a picture, a PFP or a way to digitally represent yourself within the organization. It's also a vote. One noun is one vote that allows you to direct the Nouns DAO treasury and govern the future of the ecosystem.
Yeah, and you mentioned or touched on this concept of capital, and obviously that being a pretty critical component to building any type of business, right, or any type of kind of large scale community. How in these earlier days, how are you seeing the Nouns community rally around, whether it's different proposals or start to think about, because as of today, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there's over $60 million in the actual Nouns DAO treasury itself. How are the community members or noun owners starting to think about how to deploy that or use that to continue to grow the brand awareness of nouns? And, I'm sure a couple other big initiatives that you guys have that maybe you can touch on that is trying to expand, I guess, the brand awareness of what nouns is and what you guys are trying to do.
Yeah, so I mean, yes, there's obviously a lot of capital in the treasury now. Again, we're just over 4 months into the project, and there's about 16,000 ETH in total in the Nouns DAO treasury. That yes, at present kind of equates to about 62 million USD. 10% of that capital is actually being staked. So the noun owners have created a proposal to stake a percentage of that ETH. And so, as far as I'm aware, we're one of the first NFT projects that is staking the ETH, and this is kind of a part of noun ownership now and the governance of the ecosystem. And yes, in terms of the proposals that have been passed, I believe the 28th proposal just succeeded, and that was a proposal to send a noun to the International Space Station. So. You know what? There are some noun owners that have connections to NASA, and they're kind of arranging that the community will 3D print a noun, and then in about a year's time send it to the International Space Station, and have that noun photographed by the astronauts on board the ISS. So, I mean, these are kind of proposals that are related to the proliferation of the nouns meme. That part of the community's thesis, I think, being that copies make originals more valuable, and to the extent that all of the noun owners own originals, it becomes a kind of natural piece of the governance to kind of proliferate the meme of nouns to kind of accrue value back to the originals, as a function of recognition. One way we kind of talked about this early on, although I do think it's kind of a lot more complex and maybe amorphous than this, is that we're building this kind of decentralized open source Disney, where the ownership claims on the organization are not shares but actual pictures of Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, right? Like that we own the digital originals, and the proceeds from the sale of those digital originals goes into a community pot that can be used to kind of proliferate them in the same way that a brand would proliferate its IP. It just happens to be the case that because of what NFTs allow, all of this IP it actually exists in the public domain. So nouns are CC0, Creative Commons zero license, essentially public domain IP, and so that facilitates the proliferation of the brand and of the meme, and the value isn't necessarily in an IP monopoly like an organization like Disney would have. The value actually ends up being in the ownership of the digital original, in the ownership of the pictures of Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But let's stick with, you mentioned CC0. Maybe you touched on it briefly, but maybe explain exactly what that means and what that is and why that's such an important, I won't even say trend, but really kind of topic area of discussion right now within these different, we'll say, non-fungible collective communities, what the importance of CC0 is and how that differs from what, let's say, the rights are that you get or commercial rights you get from being a nouns holder versus something like a Bored Ape or a CryptoPunk.
Yeah, so CC0, Creative Commons, is something that has actually been around for quite some time, right? I mean, this has been around for, I'm not sure when it originated, but at least a decade. And this is the idea of copy left instead of copyright, right? That the kind of default license when you create something because of the laws that exist, in the world, it is a state of copyright and of ownership, and that you can attempt to kind of explicitly override this default license by assigning something that is much, much more permissive, with the idea that there could be value in people taking the thing that you've made and remixing it, reconfiguring it, and sharing it and proliferating it. But to date, this never ever really had a viable business model that went along with it. if you created something and somebody took it and reconfigured it and released it on the web, this might be great in terms of kind of social recognition or just kind of the proliferation of something cool, but there was never really a way to monetize that before non-fungible tokens. But what non-fungible tokens have created is this idea of ownership of the digital original. And I think there's lots of precedent for this idea that copies make originals more valuable, right? The reason the Mona Lisa, in a sense, is very, very valuable is that it's famous as a function of there being so many copies that exist in the world, right? That so many non-original images of the Mona Lisa have been proliferated that everyone instantly recognizes the original and recognizes that it's important. And really, celebrity works the same way as well, right? The reason it's a big deal when you see a celebrity in real life is because you are seeing the original, and really everyone is used to seeing copies, and you have this kind of credibility, or there's this credibility that materializes as a function of being close to the original, and that of course is valuable to the extent that celebrities are famous and make a lot of money. So we all kind of implicitly recognize that copies make originals more valuable. And so all of a sudden, for the first time, there's this really powerful set of incentives that can be attached to these copyleft or Creative Commons licenses, where when you own the digital original, all of a sudden there's a very, very strong incentive to proliferate the copies. And so copyright, which is essentially a technology for stopping the proliferation of copies, actually becomes the wrong license. And what you really want is this kind of copyleft license that encourages the proliferation of copies, because it makes the originals more valuable. And so again, copy or Creative Commons is a license that has existed for a long time, but never really had these kind of very deep incentives that could be tied to it. And now for the first time they can be. And that's why I think it's become this very, very important topic of conversation within the NFT community. And I think over time that conversation is just going to grow, and people are going to recognize that this kind of way of working is the most native to this new medium and the thing that makes the most sense.
Yeah, and you mentioned copies versus the originals, right? I'm curious, one of the questions I had to you was going to be, in this world of kind of these open source collections, right, that you can monetize or create derivative works off of, where do you really see the value accruing in, let's say, a collection like Nouns? Is it going to be in, the long tail of derivative works that are created or copies that are created off of that? But it sounds like a majority of that value you think is going to actually accrue back to, let's say, the original noun of which a derivative work is created. Am I thinking about that correctly?
I think both things are true. I don't think we've yet seen a really strong example of derivatives that kind of add enough to the conversation that they become very, very valuable. That's not to say that they haven't been created. They might be out there, but I don't think the market has kind of recognized it yet. In my experience, financial markets are very, very good at kind of pricing and identifying things they've seen before, and very not good at pricing and identifying things that are completely novel. And I think most of what we're seeing in the NFT space, especially in the CC0 plus derivative NFT space, is very, very novel. It's super early. I do think in time we are going to see valuable derivative works. I'm not sure how it happens. I think people also currently have a fairly narrow definition of what a derivative might be. They think of a derivative as this kind of like low effort, clone of the original. There are lots of examples of this in the CryptoPunks and Nouns and Cryptodes universe. Somebody takes it and flips the image the other way, or adds a hat, or something like that. And that's the kind of current definition that we have of a derivative work. But a derivative work could well be, a Hollywood show that takes the original quote unquote IP and turns it into something that is extraordinarily popular, as popular as Futurama or Rick and Morty or any of the content that we're used to seeing. And it could very easily be the case that work that adds a lot to the conversation becomes in essence the derivative, and to the extent that the quote unquote IP within that show is itself in the public domain, the way that show could be monetized is actually by selling NFTs of that show. And in that sense, it could be the case that we do see very, very valuable derivatives kind of emerge on the next layer up. It could also be the case that those derivatives do turn out to only kind of drive value back to the original, in which case that would be one of the reasons I think it would be very important for these communities to have a large treasury that they can use to kind of finance or incentivize the production of related content, to the extent that the motivations for creating that kind of content would be related to getting paid in ETH or some other currency by the organization, rather than kind of developing your own IP. I think ultimately it's going to be a kind of a mix of those two models, but it's just so early on that we haven't really seen a lot of experimentation happen yet.
Yeah, and that was one thing I wanted to get into, because obviously you've seen with something like Bored Apes, for example, right? You have music groups that have popped up that are a collection of apes that are taking, let's say, a playbook out of maybe the Gorilla's success, a decade or 2 decades ago at this point. Are you seeing any early, and I know you mentioned this earlier, but are you seeing any examples of how this is starting to manifest itself in terms of these derivative works around any nouns specifically? So anyone in the community that's kind of creating a brand around their noun, or even creating a business model around their noun? I
would say that I'm aware of people that are thinking of doing this in pretty substantial ways. It is very, very early. Again, the project is about 4 months old. This idea that there might be like a really healthy business model that can be built on top of creating content or around Creative Commons IP is very new. And so I would say, again, very early, but there are some fairly serious kind of traditional content producers that are kind of hanging around the ecosystem and at least considering working with the characters and creating derivatives based on them. So I think that's pretty encouraging. The kind of consensus view I would say that we've encountered so far is that Hollywood or traditional content producers would never ever engage with this sort of IP or this sort of license. And I think we have very early indications that may not be true, that they could be very interested in doing something, and that there's a real appetite for experimenting with this new model and taking risk and really seeing what it can do.
Got it. And this, all we're talking about here too, can apply to collaboration with, let's say, other kind of NFT collections, right? Or other, I'll call them NFT communities. You look at something like Nouns and Toads, I think, as you mentioned, and as far as I'm aware, recently have come together to create something called Nodes. Really curious, again, just even from a specifics, but at a high level, what that type of collaboration looks like. Do you think that's going to be something that the Nouns community looks to do more with other NFT collectible communities, and tying it back to kind of this CC0 commentary and concept that we've been talking about here? This opens up an entirely new world for kind of creative collaboration in a sense.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's important to recognize and really one of the amazing things about operating in this way is that the Nodes collection is neither a product of the Nouns owners or the noun owners nor the Toad owners, right? It's really it's permissionless innovation that's happening. It's a specific person kind of hanging out in both of those communities, or who's a fan of those communities, that goes out and kind of decides to combine the artwork together and create a new collection. And so I think that the real power here is in essence reducing the coordination costs, right? Like if someone had to ask us permission for nodes, or we had to partner with a third party to create nodes, the kind of bandwidth of any organization at the end of the day will become constrained Whereas these kind of permissionless organizations that kind of take advantage or harness the power of the crowd, in the context of NFTs or the internet or kind of these kind of decentralized crypto projects, this is such a powerful idea because the power of the crowd is I think just so much greater than many of us intuit that it is, and that kind of collectively there's just so much content and so much value that can be created, and so it's really in explicitly not having to have that collaboration be initiated by the Nouns community or the Toads community that this becomes a very, very powerful idea.
And what was the reception because obviously the Nouns and Toads community now very much aware of what Nodes is doing, right? And someone coming in, and to your point, maybe being in both of those communities, finding an opportunity or creating an opportunity for this kind of, we'll call it, cross-collection collaboration. What was the initial reception to something like Nodes from Noun holders?
I would say within the community, people are very excited to see derivatives being created, to see people, wanting to engage with the culture and the content. I believe so. There's a project happening right now called Nouns Center that is attempting to kind of catalog, everything that's happening within the Nouns community, because again, this speaks to the power of the crowd. It's already, the community is already large enough, and there's already so much happening that it's basically impossible for any one individual to keep track of it all. And so this project is kind of attempting to catalog all of the activity in the community. And I believe there's something like 60 derivative projects already, again, after 4 months. And so I think certainly people within the community are very excited to see all of that activity happening. I think for those of us who really, deeply believe in the thesis that these copies and the proliferation of the meme makes the originals more valuable, these are very, very promising signs for what's happening. I do think, especially for us as kind of artists of the original artwork, some of us have this kind of like deep intuition that knockoffs are bad, that copies are bad, that somehow this is somebody else diluting the thing that you created. But I think these are really just kind of holdovers from the the trauma of so many years of artists having their work kind of stolen or monetized by someone else, and now that there's actually a market enforced way to kind of reap the values of these derivatives and reap the values of somebody kind of or reap the rewards from somebody remixing the thing that you created. I think that attitude over time is going to change pretty dramatically, and over time people will see it as absolutely an asset when derivatives are created based on an artist's work.
Yeah, and you keep going back to the power of the crowd and this concept of community, right? Which is obviously, what I would find to be one of the most important aspects for any type of, whether it's, even DeFi protocol all the way to, some of these NFT collectibles going forward. How can you give us an idea of, one, what the Nouns community looks like even at a high level today? Who are some of the participants, or what does that kind of demographic look like? And how important is this concept of community to the success of this type of, let's call it, creative endeavor?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that one of the very unique things about the Nouns community is that it's not only made up of noun owners, that within the context of Nouns, there are many, many different ways to engage with the project. And I think this is actually going to turn out to be a super important concept for a lot of these projects going forward. It's the case that if you think about kind of mainstream adoption or long-term adoption of any of these projects, a collection of 10,000 of X or Y is just not enough to kind of satisfy demand for kind of mainstream adoption. So I think it's the case that no matter the size of the collection, the quote unquote digital originals will remain these aspirational objects that only a small percentage of community holders will own. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I think that that's kind of it. That's like a necessary quality of creating, a great deal of value for these originals. And so it ends up becoming very important to have lots and lots of different ways for people to engage with the collections, whether that's fractionalized ownership, whether that's creating derivatives, whether that's actually building something new on the project and getting funded by the project, as is the case with the 20 plus proposals that have been passed within the Nouns ecosystem. And so again, within the Nouns ecosystem, there's this like real diversity of participants. We have the project founders that we call Nounders. We have the Noun owners that we call Nouners. We have the folks that have been funded to build something on top of Nouns, the builders. We have the people that are working on derivatives. People that are just kind of fans of the project and just kind of hanging out and learning about it. And there's a lot of developers in the community as well that are forking the open source code base and trying to create instances of the Nouns distribution mechanism, not just the artwork, derivatives of the distribution mechanism. And so again, this real diversity of owners within the community, and I think that's going to be super important for most projects going forward.
Yeah, I want to kind of take a step back or go back to a topic that we were talking about at the start of this to kind of bring this all full circle. I know, or at least from my understanding, within the last couple of weeks, you originally, as you mentioned, you were a CryptoPunk holder, have recently, as far as I'm aware, have sold your actual punk collection. And to the degree you're comfortable kind of explaining or talking through your thought process there, we'd love to hear the rationale for why you thought maybe it was time to focus on, other endeavors like Nouns, and what about that maybe punks community, and maybe this ties to CC0 that we were talking about. What about the community itself really kind of, I guess, gave you that confidence to say, this is no longer something that I want to be a part of or that I need to own?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for me, it's kind of it's a complex issue with lots and lots of things that are tied up into it. And again, I think generally when I've had a lot of conviction to buy or sell things over the years, that conviction has kind of grown for many, many different reasons. Maybe it's a little bit like a neural network where you have all these inputs and you just have to hit this kind of threshold that actually triggers an action. And so I can talk about some of those inputs, but there's not any one specific thing that finally triggered it. I think certainly crypto Twitter picked up very heavily on the IP rights component of the conversation where punks don't necessarily kind of have built into them this method for the proliferation of the copies. And certainly that was one of the reasons. But, I think I think it was initially driven by this idea that the punk's copyright kind of continued to be owned by the original creators, which is of course that is fine and that's their choice, and if that's kind of the way they think the maximum amount of value will accrue to the project, that's certainly something that they're entitled to do. But I think as someone who has a pretty deep thesis around how value is going to accrue to originals in the context of NFTs, it just seemed very, very important to me that the power of the community is harnessed to proliferate the meme, and that would be the thing that would drive the maximum amount of value and attention back to the originals. And in the context of trying to censor that proliferation, that it was very possible that punks would not be as historically important as people thought they were, because not enough people would ever learn about them, that they wouldn't be kind of memed and turned into these important cultural artifacts without having the incentive layer that would allow that kind of remixing and proliferation. And then also, as someone who had originally had a thesis about building a personal brand around a punk, it just didn't make sense to try to continue to build a brand around something where somebody else had a stronger claim to that thing than I did, right? It's just illogical because it just ends up being too much risk at some point. The I don't know, the CryptoPunks movie could come out and 4156 is not the character that I wanted it to be in the movie. And of course, that would be a risk with CC0 as well. But in the context of CC0, there would be lots and lots of different narratives that would be kind of competing to define what something meant. Having just a single narrative controlled by another organization seemed like it could potentially be problematic. And then of course there's also the kind of question of valuation. Punks having kind of gone up by a factor of 50 to 100x in ETH terms over a year. Again, many reasons for deciding to make the specific decision to sell, but there's a certain, I think, schism between the valuation of the assets and the model that would lead to proliferation that would kind of support those valuations. And in the context of these very, very high valuations, and then also the kind of potential, at least, lack of understanding within the community around how these things should proliferate. I think that was what led to the decision ultimately.
Yeah, no, and that's fascinating. I really appreciate that kind of insight, because I know, as you mentioned, it was a combination of things, right? It wasn't just one that kind of brought you to or triggered that decision on your end. This entire concept around, again, copyright, IP, open kind of Creative Commons is one I think we're going to continue to see kind of front and center for any of these new projects that are trying to gain some type of, bootstrap, some type of early community around what it is that they're doing. One of the kind of last questions I had for you before, because you and I could probably talk about this stuff for hours on end. Are there any other NFT, we'll call them collectibles, or creative IP projects that are leveraging Web3 that are on your radar that you find interesting outside of any of the ones that we've already talked about today?
Yeah, that's a good question. In general, I would say I'm just very interested in any project that is using CC0 or any other kind of very permissive license, and then also trying to think about novel forms of distribution and novel kind of incentive engineering that will solve the problem of the proliferation of copies and solve the problem of creating incentives for people to build on top of the assets as a base layer. I think in general, this idea that what the things that are being built are open source brands, that they're essentially brand protocols that at their core really are a set of primitives that will encourage other people to build on top of them. I don't think that's super widespread yet. I think Nouns, potentially Cryptodes, are the first two that really kind of grok that idea. And certainly I would be on the lookout for any other project that is starting to think about the world in this way. Chain runners actually might be another example. Again, something that is on chain, CC0, and really starts to think about the primitives as a kind of base layer that other people will take and experiment with. Dom, who works on Nouns, his loot project as well is another one of these. That's well known. But in general, I think that thesis is right. That you start with the primitives, just like you can think about ETH as a kind of a primitive that all of the dApps on Ethereum kind of take and use to create value and create this kind of interoperability layer that is very, very interesting. You can think about loot or chain runners or Nouns as this kind of layer of primitives that are there for experimenting with, for building on top of. For creating a kind of a layer of cultural interoperability, and that will produce an ecosystem that at the end of the day is just far, far more interesting and more valuable than a centralized organization can produce. And that is the thesis that we have within these communities, and the thing that we're working towards.
Yeah, I very much agree too. I think that's spot on and really well said. Yeah, it summarizes it perfectly. So before I let you go, for those who are interested, where can people find out more information about you, what you're doing, and then also Nouns for those who are interested in learning more?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can follow me on Twitter at punk4156. You can follow the Nouns project on Twitter. It's at Nouns DAO. If you want to learn more about Nouns, you can go to Nouns.wtf. And if you just kind of scroll down on the main page, there's a pretty good, like a collapsible menu that explains the project, and it attempts to introduce some of the concepts that we're playing with. And then Nouns Discord is just discord.gg/nouns, and that's where you can find me for the most part. We're doing some pretty interesting things in there, so please come and check it out.
That's perfect. Well, I think we've certainly sowed the seeds for future conversations around this, right? So excited to get you back on maybe in a few months or sometime next year and see how this is all kind of transpiring and how it's playing out. So in the meantime, really appreciate you taking the time and sitting with me and talking about this. I think it's going to be another really interesting conversation for this audience. So thank you for joining me.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks for having me. That was fun.